She was doing all sorts of satanic things. She was going through a lot of her rituals, and it was very uncomfortable while we were there. Jeremy and Ashley had gone back to the hotel. They were not there anymore. They'd had dinner with us and then they'd gone back.
Bette Davis was a Hollywood powerhouse. 10 Oscar nominations, 2 wins, and a reputation for being fearless in an industry that often tried to silence women. But behind the accolades and the sharp wit lived a woman few truly knew. Her daughter, Barbara Davis Hyman, would later pull back the velvet curtain, revealing a side of Bette that fans and critics alike never imagined. For years, Bette crafted her image as a tough, no-nonsense survivor, adored for her strength and brilliance. Yet Barbara tells a much darker story, a story of a mother who could be cruel, manipulative, and even frightening behind closed doors. "My mother was not the woman you saw on the screen," Barbara once said. "She was something else entirely, something much colder." For decades, fans clung to the image of Bette as the ultimate fighter, the actress who battled studios, rivals, and ageism. But now, through the eyes of her daughter, we are asked to reconsider. Was her public fierceness hiding something even more unsettling in private? To understand the complicated woman Bette Davis became, we have to start at the very beginning, with a little girl whose own childhood was filled with loneliness and loss. A childhood shaped by darkness. Long before Bette Davis became a screen icon, she was just Ruth Elizabeth Davis, a girl growing up in the aftermath of her parents' bitter divorce. Her father, a struggling attorney, abandoned the family when Bette was just 7 years old. Her mother, Ruthie, struggled to raise Bette and her sister Bobby alone, scraping by while trying to heal her own broken heart. The family eventually moved to New York, chasing a fresh start that would plant the seeds of ambition inside young Bette. There, she studied acting, poured herself into the arts, and decided to change her name to Bette, inspired by a tragic literary figure, foreshadowing the emotional intensity that would define her future. It's said that Bette's earliest experiences taught her 2 things: never to trust love and never to show weakness. "I was a fighter from the start," she once admitted. "Life taught me early that softness was a weakness you couldn't afford." Those early wounds would stay with her, silently shaping the woman and the mother she would later become. Armed with ambition and a hunger for control, Bette Davis took her first unsteady steps into the brutal world of Hollywood, a place where she would have to fight for every scrap of recognition. The rise of a reluctant rebel. When Bette Davis first arrived in Hollywood, it didn't go as planned. Studio executives dismissed her as plain and ordinary. One producer famously said, "She has as much sex appeal as Slim Somerville," comparing her to a male comedian known for his gangly awkwardness. Crushed, but not defeated, Bette dug in deeper. A disastrous screen test nearly sent her back to New York, but instead, it lit a fire inside her. She refused to be overlooked, refused to fade into the background. "I will not be ignored," Bette declared, a statement that would become a theme both on and off the screen. Through sheer determination, she clawed her way to recognition. She wasn't the typical Hollywood starlet. She was sharp, forceful, electric. That rebellion, that rawness, became her signature. Audiences didn't just watch Bette Davis. They felt her. But even as she built a career out of defying expectations, that same relentless drive began to harden her heart, especially when it came to those closest to her. As Bette's star rose, so did the intensity of her battles, with studios, with critics, and with anyone who dared to challenge her authority. early career chaos, Bette's critical breakthrough came with 1934's Of Human Bondage, where she played a cruel, manipulative waitress. It was a role that felt almost too real, some would later whisper. The performance stunned audiences and critics alike. "Until then," she said, "I didn't know the power that ugliness and rawness could hold." From there, she won her first Oscar for Dangerous, and another for Jezebel just a few years later. But fame didn't bring peace. Bette grew increasingly frustrated with the roles Warner Brothers offered her. Vapid, one-dimensional women who paled compared to what she knew she could do. She fought back, even suing the studio in one of the earliest and most daring legal battles against Hollywood's studio system. Though she ultimately lost the case, she won respect, carving out new rights for actors and redefining the industry. Yet her ferocity wasn't reserved just for executives. Those closest to her began to feel the sharp edge of her ambition, including her young daughter, who would later recall, "She wasn't just fighting the system, she was fighting everyone around her." With fame now firmly in her grip, Bette Davis seemed unstoppable. But inside the walls of her grand home, another darker story was unfolding. A story that would remain hidden for decades. The woman behind the curtain. Public success. Private turmoil. By the 1940s, Bette Davis was one of the biggest stars in the world. Her performances in films like Now, Voyager, and All About Eve cemented her as a force of nature in Hollywood. Her sharp tongue, commanding presence, and undeniable talent made her a living legend. But behind closed doors, Barbara Hyman describes a very different Bette. A mother who could switch from charming to cruel in the blink of an eye. "She could charm an entire room," Barbara said, "then destroy you with a single glance when no one was looking." Bette's thirst for control wasn't limited to movie sets. At home, she demanded absolute obedience. Emotional volatility became the norm. Moments of warmth were fleeting, replaced by icy criticism and suffocating expectations. Fame gave Bette the illusion of control she craved, but it also masked the growing storm of bitterness and loneliness that clouded her private life. And her daughter, caught in that storm, would pay a heavy price. As the public cheered Bette's triumphs, her personal life, especially her marriages, unraveled in ways that would leave even deeper scars. The fragile institution of marriage. When it came to love, Bette Davis fought as fiercely as she did for her career, but the battlefield was even bloodier. Over the course of her life, Bette married 4 times, and each marriage unraveled with a heartbreaking inevitability. Her relationships were marred by betrayals, forced sacrifices, and an intense need for control that left little room for true intimacy. Bette's first marriage to bandleader Harmon Nelson crumbled under the weight of her skyrocketing career and his growing resentment. "He didn't want me to be famous," Bette once confessed. "He wanted me to be his little wife at home, and I could never be that." Later marriages to Arthur Farnsworth and William Grant Sherry fared no better. Her husbands struggled to deal with Bette's fame, her ambition, and her fierce independence. Even her final marriage to actor Gary Merrill, whom she met while filming All About Eve, started with passionate hope, but descended into alcoholism, bitter arguments, and allegations of violence. Tragically, Bette also endured forced abortions, pushed by Hollywood executives who saw pregnancy as a career-ending scandal for their leading ladies. These experiences, layered atop childhood wounds, built an emotional armor around Bette, a need to control everything and everyone close to her. It's little wonder that the same traits that made her a trailblazer in Hollywood also made her a difficult, often damaging force in her personal life. Barbara Hyman, her daughter, would later reflect, "There was no room for anyone else's dreams but hers. Loving her was like trying to hold on to a flame. You'd only end up burned." And as Bette's marriages collapsed, the one relationship that should have been unbreakable between mother and daughter began to fracture in even more devastating ways. The birth of a difficult mother-daughter relationship, growing up in the shadow of a living legend, was no fairy tale for Barbara Davis Hyman. From her earliest memories, Barbara struggled to find her own identity while living under the suffocating weight of her mother's expectations. Bette didn't just want a daughter, she wanted a prodigy. A mirror image of herself who could fulfill all the dreams she didn't dare entrust to a man. Barbara recalls how every moment of affection from her mother came with strings attached. Praise was rare, criticism was constant, and the message was always clear: "You are never good enough." "She loved me when it suited her image," Barbara later wrote, "but when the cameras stopped rolling, the love disappeared." Living in Bette's house meant living by Bette's rules, unbending, often cruel rules that changed with her moods. Barbara was expected to perform, to excel, to reflect glory back onto her mother. Failure was punished not with lectures, but with cold silences or devastating ridicule. The walls of their home were filled with Academy Awards and glowing reviews, but love was rationed, conditional, fleeting. The emotional tug-of-war left deep scars. Barbara tried everything to win her mother's approval, excelling academically, pursuing her own acting career, but nothing was ever enough. To be her daughter, she said, was to be in a constant audition for her affection. And soon, the darkness that had always hovered just beneath Bette Davis's surface would reveal itself in even stranger, more chilling ways that Barbara could no longer explain away. Claims of witchcraft and occult rituals. As shocking as it may sound, Barbara Hyman's accusations didn't stop at emotional abuse. In her bombshell memoir, she claimed that Bette Davis dabbled in dark rituals, an eerie undercurrent to a life already filled with shadows. According to Barbara, Bette believed in the power of revenge and the energy of rituals, turning to them when she felt slighted or betrayed. Barbara described nights where candles were lit, cryptic phrases were spoken, and enemies were cursed with an intensity that chilled her to the bone. These weren't harmless superstitions, Barbara insisted. They were calculated acts of hatred masked as spiritual practices. She didn't just want to beat her enemies, Barbara claimed. She wanted to destroy them. It's said that Bette viewed her career and her personal life as a battlefield, and she was willing to call on any weapon she could to win. The lines between the characters she played and the woman she became began to blur, until it was difficult to tell where reality ended and performance began. Of course, some dismissed Barbara's claims as the wild exaggerations of a bitter daughter. But for those who knew Bette best, the idea that she might flirt with the occult wasn't so hard to believe. "There was always a darkness about her," one former friend whispered, a feeling that she was tapping into something dangerous. And while the rituals were terrifying enough, what left the deepest wounds were the constant, grinding acts of emotional warfare that defined Barbara's life with her mother. Emotional and psychological abuse. If there was one thing Barbara Hyman learned early, it was that love from Bette Davis always came with a price. The emotional warfare at home was relentless. One minute, Bette could be affectionate, lavishing attention and praise, and the next, she would turn icy, unleashing brutal criticisms designed to cut deep. Barbara described tactics that felt more like psychological warfare than parenting, threatening suicide to guilt her children into obedience, withholding affection as punishment, publicly humiliating them for small mistakes. "She could destroy you with a glance," Barbara said. And she knew it. Bette's need for control dominated every aspect of their home life. Her children were props in her carefully curated image, beautiful when they behaved, banished when they didn't. Even Barbara's milestones, graduations, birthdays, were treated as opportunities for Bette to shine, not for her daughter to grow. In private, Barbara lived with a growing sense of dread, never knowing what would trigger her mother's next eruption. Small failures became massive betrayals in Bette's eyes. "It was like living with a ticking bomb," Barbara wrote. The damage from years of emotional manipulation shaped Barbara's life long after she left home. She carried the scars into adulthood, the need for approval, the fear of rejection, the ever-present question, was she ever truly loved? And even after death, Bette Davis found a way to deliver one final, devastating blow. One that would forever cement the fracture between mother and daughter. Betrayal after death. When Bette Davis passed away in 1989, it shocked the world, not just because a Hollywood legend had fallen, but because of the cold final act she left behind. In her will, Bette cut Barbara out completely with chilling precision. There was no heartfelt message, no room for reconciliation, just cold, legal language severing the tie forever. To Barbara, it wasn't about the money. It was about the message. After a lifetime of fighting for her mother's approval, after years of enduring psychological wounds, Bette's will was a final confirmation. You were never enough. "She didn't just abandon me in life," Barbara said. "She abandoned me in death, too." The media exploded with the story. Fans were stunned. How could the woman who gave us All About Eve and now Voyager also be capable of such cruelty? How could the indomitable Bette Davis, who fought so hard for her own voice, deny her daughter even a shred of kindness in her final words? It was a betrayal that reopened every wound Barbara had tried to heal. And it raised an uncomfortable question. Can greatness on the screen ever excuse cruelty at home? As the world mourned the legend, the woman behind the legend, flawed, brilliant, and brutal, was finally coming into focus, thanks to the daughter who could no longer stay silent. Public image versus private monster. For decades, the world adored Bette Davis. Her on-screen brilliance, her sharp wit, and her fearless roles made her a symbol of strength and independence. In interviews, she was charming, self-deprecating, and often surprisingly candid. To her fans, she was untouchable, an icon who redefined what it meant to be a leading lady in Hollywood. But behind the flashbulbs and the applause, another truth simmered, one far less glamorous. Barbara Davis Hyman's revelations tore the mask away from the legend. According to her, Bette Davis was not just complicated, she was cruel. The woman millions idolized was, at home, a volatile figure who wielded power like a weapon, striking hardest at the people who loved her most. "People think of her as a survivor," Barbara once said, but surviving her was the real story. Not everyone was willing to believe it. Close friends, loyal fans, and Hollywood insiders rallied to Bette's defense. They painted Barbara as a bitter daughter, resentful of her mother's fame and larger-than-life personality. In the public eye, Bette was still the woman who had broken barriers for actresses everywhere, a warrior against the misogyny of early Hollywood. But whispers persisted. Staff who worked in her home, acquaintances who had seen flashes of her temper, colleagues who had watched her manipulate situations off camera. They murmured behind closed doors. They talked about the icy silences, the sudden rages, the moments when Bette's force of nature became something colder, something harder to excuse. "She could charm you or crush you," one former confidant admitted, and she decided which it would be. Barbara's book didn't just offer accusations, it offered context. It showed how fame can distort, how the fight to survive in Hollywood's ruthless machine could twist even the most brilliant spirits into something dark. It asked a question that still haunts Bette's legacy. Can greatness excuse cruelty? And perhaps nowhere was that cruelty and the emotional wreckage it left behind more visible than in Bette Davis's legendary feud with another Hollywood titan, Joan Crawford. The bitter legacy of Bette Davis and Joan Crawford. Bette Davis and Joan Crawford, two names forever linked in Hollywood lore, not just for their fierce talent, but for their even fiercer hatred. To outsiders, their feud was juicy tabloid fodder, a clash of divas battling for supremacy. But Barbara Davis Hyman's insights revealed that for Bette, it was deeply personal, a wound that never healed. According to Barbara, Bette saw Joan Crawford not just as a rival, but as a usurper, a woman who had everything Bette had fought tooth and nail to earn, and who, in Bette's eyes, used manipulation instead of talent to rise. Crawford's charm, her ability to navigate Hollywood's male-dominated system with a smile and a wink, infuriated Bette, who prided herself on her raw skill and unwillingness to play the game. Their animosity reached its boiling point during the making of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, a movie that capitalized on their mutual hatred to fuel unforgettable performances. Off-screen, the tensions were electric. Stories abound of Bette allegedly sabotaging scenes to make Crawford look bad, and Crawford retaliating with petty, calculated cruelty. It wasn't just professional competition, it was psychological warfare. Barbara painted a picture of a mother obsessed, not with winning, but with destroying. It wasn't enough for her to succeed, she said. She had to watch her enemies fail. For Bette, Crawford symbolized everything she despised: fakery, manipulation, and unearned success. Their rivalry wasn't just about Hollywood power, it was about identity, about validation. And in that battle, Bette's darker instincts took over. But the bitterness between Bette and Joan wasn't just professional. At the heart of it all was a love triangle, a betrayal that would scar Bette Davis in ways Hollywood gossip columns never fully revealed. Love, betrayal, and the love triangle that shattered Bette. Few betrayals cut as deep as the one Bette Davis endured at the hands of Joan Crawford. And it wasn't just about career sabotage, it was about love. At the center of their personal war was a man, actor Franchot Tone. Bette fell hard for Tone while filming Dangerous in 1935. She admired his intelligence, his wit, his sophistication. For once, she saw a future that wasn't defined by career ambition, but by genuine affection. "I fell in love with Franchot," Bette would later admit. And he fell in love with Joan. While Bette struggled to express her feelings, Joan moved in with precision. She charmed Tone, seduced him, and married him, all while Bette watched helplessly from the sidelines. The humiliation was total. Crawford didn't just win the man Bette loved, she did it publicly, triumphantly. Barbara Hyman later described how this heartbreak hardened her mother. After that, she said, Bette stopped believing in real love. Everyone became a rival or a tool. No one could be trusted. The betrayal didn't just destroy Bette's hope for happiness, it fueled decades of bitterness. Every glance, Every insult between the two actresses was laced with the sting of that original wound. Their rivalry became legend, but at its core, it was a tragedy, a love story that ended before it ever truly began, leaving only resentment in its place. And as the years wore on, the battles Bette waged against others and against herself took a heavy toll, leading to a lonely and painful final chapter. The final days: decline, isolation, and defiance. In her later years, the invincible Bette Davis was forced to confront the one enemy she could never defeat: time. Stripped of her youthful fire, weakened by cancer, strokes, and countless surgeries, Bette faced her final chapter with the same ferocity that had defined her life. But the costs were staggering. Barbara described visiting her mother in those final years as heartbreaking. The once indomitable star was now frail, hunched, her body ravaged by illness, but her spirit still flickering defiantly. She fought death like she fought everything else, Barbara said, stubborn, proud, and alone. The emotional wounds between mother and daughter never fully healed. There were brief reconciliations, tentative steps toward forgiveness. But old patterns re-emerged too easily. The damage done in childhood had left scars too deep for time to erase. Bette spent her final days largely isolated, estranged from many of her former friends, and, most painfully, from her own daughter. Yet even at the end, she refused to surrender to sentimentality. She died on October 6, 1989, in France, after attending the San Sebastian Film Festival, still seeking the validation of her peers. Her death marked the end of an era, but it also reopened all the old wounds, especially for Barbara, who would soon face the world's scrutiny as she told her side of the story. And as Barbara stepped forward with her controversial memoir, a new chapter began, one that forced the world to reckon with the woman behind the legend in all her flawed, painful humanity. Human, flawed, and still iconic. Barbara Davis Hyman's memoir, My Mother's Keeper, sent shockwaves through Hollywood. For the first time, the carefully maintained image of Bette Davis as a tough but lovable fighter was challenged with a darker, more complicated truth. Fans were outraged. Critics accused Barbara of betrayal. But others, quietly, cautiously, said they believed every word. Barbara insisted she wasn't seeking revenge. She was seeking understanding. "You can't love someone properly," she said, "until you see them clearly." Her revelations forced a painful but necessary conversation about how we treat our icons. Can someone be both a genius and a tyrant? A pioneer and a destroyer? In Bette Davis's case, the answer was yes. Bette's impact on Hollywood remains undeniable. She broke barriers for women in film, demanded respect, and changed the kinds of roles available to actresses forever. Her performances in All About Eve, Now, Voyager, and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane are timeless masterclasses in human complexity. But she was also deeply flawed, a woman driven by fear, ambition, and an almost pathological need for control. Her brilliance and her cruelty were two sides of the same coin. Barbara's painful honesty allows us to see Bette Davis not as a myth, but as a human being, capable of greatness, but not immune to darkness. In the end, that truth doesn't diminish her legacy, it deepens it. Final reflection. Behind every legend lies a real person, and sometimes the real story is far more powerful and far more heartbreaking than the myth we wish to believe.